When a firm makes decisions, there's going to be a number of things that influence it, called, would you believe, corporate influences. So that's what we're going to be looking at on this particular video. Definitions incredibly straightforward. Factors that affect what managers should take into account when making strategic decisions. Well, the first one is the objectives of the organisation. So what is the organisation trying to do, and to what extent does this decision meet those objectives? What about ethics, which is the firm's approach to morals? Is it right to do something, or is it wrong to do something? So, for example, it's unlikely that a company like Lush would use as a supplier a firm that itself tests on animals' products, because that's not what Lush do. So there'll be stuff written in within their contracts to do that. So even if it would be a cheaper decision to go for that particular firm, that isn't something that Lush would do, because it's just wrong. Linked to that, there's corporate culture. Culture simply means the way we do things around here. So would the decision fit in with the way we do things around here, or would it cause some problems? Remember, culture clash is often a reason why mergers fail. Your financial position is obviously going to have an impact on the decision-making process. So something might look good in the long term, but it may well be that you're going through, say, a liquidity crisis, and you simply can't finance it, so you don't take that decision. The position of a company with regard to its internal strengths and weaknesses, and the external opportunities and threats that are available to it, will obviously also impact on their decision making, as will the resources they have available, or the resources that they can access. So, for example, there could be a market opportunity arising in China, but they simply haven't got the Chinese experts to go with that, or the means to acquire them. They'll also need to take into account the relative power of their stakeholders. So, for example, if you're a farmer and you're supplying to Tesco as your customer have an awful lot of power over you. Similarly, your suppliers may have an awful lot of power, or your customers, or your workers. It may well be that your workers are strongly organised in a trade union, and that might impact upon what you can do. So there's a summary of all of the corporate influences. Corporate timescales is looking at how long into the future a firm tends to look when it makes its decisions. So some firms operate in the short term. They make decisions, if you like, this week for what's going to happen next month, or in the near future. Often that happens because there's a pressure on those firms to maximize their profits or shareholder returns. Because basically, if you're invested in a firm, you could well want your money back now. So the financial markets will often be the biggest judge of that. So Richard Branson, for example, he turned his limited company into a PLC, and a few years later he bought back the shares because he was really concerned that the financial markets were just looking for money now, whereas he was looking, about his loopy ideas about sending people into space and that sort of thing. So he was looking long term, and that conflicted with their desire for short-term returns. The point about short-termism is that it might be at the cost of long-term growth. So if you are giving your profits back to the shareholders in the form of dividends, that means that you are not ploughing them back into the company for long-term growth. It's likely to lead to a lack of money for investment into research and development or training, as a result of which you're more likely to look at your workers as simply, sort of like Mr. Burns looks at his workers in The Simpsons, for what you can get out of them, rather than looking at perhaps their long-term objectives. So we tend to have what's called a hard human resource strategy. Other firms have a more long-term objective, where their focus is looking at the long-term aims and objectives of the organisation. Evidence that a firm is doing this, where you're likely to see heavy investment in research and development. They're likely to be constantly looking at their products or their processes. They are likely to use their human resources as, rather than a cost, as an actual resource. So they'll be wanting to recruit and retain talent in the organisation. And similarly, with their suppliers, they're likely to see them as partners rather than people who they can screw money out of. So they tend to work on longer term relationships with suppliers and other external stakeholders. But of course, it may well be that by looking at the long term, they actually don't survive in the short term. So there's pros and cons both ways. There are two broad ways that firms make decisions. Either they go by evidence or they go by gut feeling. Instinctively, I think as a business student, you think evidence is the best way, and it can be sometimes, but not in every case. So evidence-based decision making, it tends to be more scientific. It's backed up by research, so you've got a reasonably good idea before you make a decision that it's going to be the right one. Hopefully you can simulate or test it. So for example, you do your market research, you test the product perhaps in a certain area, you amend it to see how it's working. Now the benefits of that is that it will reduce your risk because you've got a little bit more idea as to what is likely to happen, and that's called objective decision making. Where's your counterbalance? Well, that quote on the right hand side: nothing slows down an organization more than paralysis by analysis. In other words, they're spending so long looking at the fluff in their tummy buttons that they actually forget to look forward. So what's the process? Well, first of all, they need to identify the problem that they're dealing with, gather data on that, look at the alternatives available to dealing with that problem, weigh up the evidence for all of the alternatives. Then they plump for the one that they're going to go for. They put that one into operation, and then they look at the results, and they then go back, and the circle sort of restarts. And again, you can see immediately from there, there's so many steps involved that could easily take a long time, but you're going to have a lot of data to work with. The alternative to going with the evidence is going by gut feeling, called subjective decision making. You do something because you feel as if it's the right thing or the right time. Donald Trump, very well known for being a subjective decision maker, used to drive his advisors balmy because he'd suddenly go on something and sort of run with it. And sometimes it worked. More often in his particular case, it didn't. So it's based on intuition. It enables an organisation to make a rapid decision. Now, it's particularly useful where experienced managers actually understand the market. So if you're working with experts, then there's a fair chance that they're going to get it right. Or alternatively, it could be a dominant leader. So look at that quote from Richard Branson on the right-hand side. I rely far more on gut instinct than researching huge amounts of statistics. Steve Jobs at Apple used to also do the same thing. Now you'll notice there they are both very well known dominant leaders. Now, if you want a bit of counterbalance, Sir Fred Goodwin at the Royal Bank of Scotland, he also often went on gut feeling, and he drove the Royal Bank of Scotland into the biggest loss ever made in the UK. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So where might you want to employ this? Well, maybe where things are moving very, very, very quickly, so you can't pause to gather the evidence and think about it. It may well be, say, for example, that one of your rivals has put in a bid to take over another firm, and you've got to respond pretty quickly as to whether you're going to put in a counter bid. And of course, if there's an opportunity like that that just suddenly crops up, then maybe that could be where subjective decision making is the better approach. Now that quote on the left hand side is your counterbalance here, that you might have a gut feeling about something, but that could just be irritable bowel syndrome rather than something based on reality. And if you want to go for a balanced type conclusion, that little quote from Robert Heller there: never ignore a gut feeling, but never believe that it's enough. I think if you can do an answer based around that, then that will give you a reasonable conclusion on a question based on corporate influences. That's it.